If I was to ask you, what is the most famous verse in the Bible, I reckon most of us would agree on what that is. Maybe one or two of us may have other ideas, but probably the most famous verse in the Bible is John chapter 3 and verse 16. How many people would agree with that? Probably. Yeah. For God, what does it say? For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever should believe in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. God so loved the world. And that tells us something about God's heart to us, doesn't it? God loved the world. But it meant, because he loved the world, he had to give his Son so that we could be reconciled to him. You know, the big thing about the Christian faith is that God forgives our sin because Jesus came and paid the price for it. It's a simple message, isn't it? But it's what we believe. God so loved the world, he gave his one and only Son. Why? That Jesus would take upon himself our sin, that we might be forgiven and reconciled to the God who so loves us. That's basically what the Christian faith is about. And that tells us really primarily about God, about his heart, a heart of love. And it's important for us to remember that as we look at this, as we look at what we're about to look at. Because it also tells us something about ourselves, doesn't it? It tells us that there was something wrong with us, something so far wrong that the only way that God could fix it was to sacrifice his Son. So it tells us something about God. God's heart to us is heart of love, but it also tells us something about ourselves. And you know, we're approaching Easter, aren't we? And the closer we get to Easter, the closer we get to the cross. And there are two things about that dynamic, all right, that is important for us to understand. The cross, at the cross, who God is, his glory, the things that are amazing about him, are revealed more clearly at the cross than anywhere else that we can look. You know, God's glory is on display. God shines most brightly through the cross, who he is. But it also does something to us. It exposes who we are. There's a revelation of God at the cross, but also it tells us the closer we get, the more we become exposed for what we are. The reason Jesus had to die on the cross becomes clearer the closer we come to the cross. That light of the cross shines and exposes something about us. And so God loved the world, so loved the world. We've got to remember that as we look at this chapter in chapter 27. Because one of the things that chapter 27 makes clear to us is that, as the Apostle Paul writes in Romans chapter 3, there is no one righteous, not even one. Nobody is righteous. And we're going to have a look at that by looking at the various characters and groups in this chapter. We begin, don't we, by seeing the chief priests, the religious leaders. And it says, verse 1, when daybreak came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people. It probably means the whole of the Sanhedrin, the whole ruling council of God's people. What were they doing? So now bear in mind, the rulers of God's people, the chief priests, the elders, what was their role? What were they meant to be doing? These are the people who have the privilege and responsibility of representing, or think of it like this, representing, reminding people of who God is and his heart to them and what he requires of them. And so, that being the case, just think how far off they are when we look at what they're doing right there in verse 1. They were plotting against Jesus to put him to death. Of all the people in the world to be wanting to put Jesus to death, the last people should have been the chief priests and the elders. They're the very last people that you'd have expected wanting to put Jesus to death. But that's what they were doing. And I don't know how you judge them for that, how you think about them when you think about that. But it is shocking, isn't it? God sent his son, the one who was promised all the way through the Old Testament. When he comes, they want to kill him. They're plotting to kill him. By the way, it's not insignificant that they're plotting to kill him. They've already decided to kill him. They've tried him in front of Caiaphas. And there, they found him guilty of blasphemy. That was the charge. Now, if any of us were a religious leader at that time, and you came to the conclusion, or you had to make an assessment about Jesus, you only had two options, and that was it. Either one, given all that Jesus said about himself, given the life that he lived, either you fall down and you worship him, and you acknowledge he really is the Son of God, the Christ, the Messiah. Either you acknowledge all those things, so they either needed to acknowledge him, or if you deny that, then he is a blasphemer. He's a blasphemer. And under Jewish law, under Hebrew law, says it, Leviticus chapter 24, verse 16, whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord must be put to death. And so now think about that. The religious leaders, either they acknowledged all that he was and all who he was. Either they acknowledge it and honor him, or they deny it and put him to death. And that means that when we boil it down, what really was the sin of those religious leaders? It was the sin of unbelief. They didn't believe Jesus was who he was. That's what it boils down to. They didn't believe he was who he was. And so they had to put him to death. But do you know what? As I said, whatever any of us might think about those religious leaders, probably all of us in this room were also unbelievers. Maybe you are at the moment an unbeliever. And that means there's the same thing in the root of your heart as those religious leaders. And if you was a religious leader among them, okay, there are various groups there, religious leaders, you may have been a religious leader, you would have been putting Jesus to death. I would have been. I became a believer at the age of 21. If I was a 20-year-old, religious leader and elder, I'd have been wanting Jesus dead. That's a shocking thing, isn't it? Because of unbelief. So there's the religious leaders that we see here. Remember, no one is righteous. They weren't even righteous. Far, 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 far from it. Not only do we see that there, but if we look at the story with Judas Iscariot. Again, whatever we might think about Judas Iscariot, from the perspective of the religious leaders, think about it from their perspective. Then Judas, verse 3, his betrayer, seeing that Jesus had been condemned, was full of remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. And he said, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. Now look at their response. What is that to us? They said, see to it yourself, or that's your responsibility. Now firstly, that should have been a big deal to them, because Judas betrayed Jesus, but here he's telling them, by the way, he's innocent, and they were about to put him to death. So it should have been something to them. But more importantly, the very next thing that Judas did is he went and he hanged himself. And so these religious leaders were confronted with a man, from their perspective, who was overwhelmed, crushed, stricken by a weight of guilt that he just could not bear. Overwhelmed, crushed. This is a truly broken, devastated man. And he comes to these religious leaders and they say, what's that to us? How calloused of heart. Remember, they're meant to represent God. This is what it says about God, just reading from Isaiah. He will not break a bruised reed, and he will not put out a smouldering wick. That's the heart of God. Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, and then get this. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted. Heal the brokenhearted. And they're meant to represent God. What is that to us? They're not only are their hearts unbelieving, but they are hardened and calloused and uncaring. Now, it may be that some of us here have had bad experiences of religious leaders in churches or elsewhere. But I want to remind every one of us, the Lord is not indifferent. And right now, if your heart is broken, even if it's your fault, even if it's something that you've done that you deeply regret, or maybe it's things that are outside of your control, a bruised reed he will not break. I want to encourage you to come to Jesus. He's come to bind up the brokenhearted. The religious leaders, they were so far off the mark. We see it also, don't we, in the situation with Barabbas. Pilate, we'll come to him in a moment, but he wants to get Jesus off the hook. And he presents Barabbas, who we'll think about him as well in a few moments, thinking that surely they'll choose to release Jesus over Barabbas. But what does it say? It tells us that the religious leaders persuaded the people to ask for Barabbas over Jesus. They used their power and influence it was an abuse of their power and influence. So the religious leaders, they were far from righteous. Well, then we got Pilate. What about him? Well, verse 18. Concerning Jesus and the religious leaders, it says this: for he knew it was because of envy that they had handed him, that's Jesus, over. That Pilate was not at all persuaded. So remember, the religious leaders, their problem is a problem of the heart, unbelief. Pilate, he didn't have that same unbelief. I'm sure he didn't believe Jesus was all he claimed to be. Pilate didn't really know that much about Jesus. He'll have heard about him, but he wouldn't have really known who he was. But Pilate was persuaded that this was a miscarriage of justice. He knew that much. And we see, don't we, Pilate trying, as I say, to get Jesus off the hook. He asked the question when they asked for Barabbas over Jesus. Why? What has he done? And their answer, crucify him. That's the only answer they've got. Why? Pilate's wife has this dream we read about, and she says to Pilate, have nothing to do with this innocent man. Pilate knew Jesus wasn't guilty of what they were claiming. When it came to it, he wanted nothing to do with it. He says in verse 24, the second part of it, I am innocent of this man's blood. He washed his hands. So this has got nothing to do with me. I'm innocent of this man's blood, and he hands him over. Pilate. Well, Pilate, as I said, knew that Jesus wasn't guilty of what he was being charged with. And Pilate did have the power to release Jesus. He had the power to do that. And yet, he handed him over anyway. Why did he do that? Why did he just hand him over anyway? Well, it wasn't because he thought Jesus was guilty. It wasn't really because he was scared of the crowds. But it was because, it says, he saw that it was getting nowhere and that they were about to riot. They were close to a riot. Verse 24. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that a riot was starting instead, he took some water, washed his hands in front of the crowd, and said, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourself. So he hands Jesus over because of a riot. You see, Pilate, apparently, now, we don't know this 100%, but history outside of the Bible tells us that Pilate had already twice come under the scrutiny of Caesar. Why? Because of uprisings in Israel. And the last, whatever the case, we don't know about that for certain, but we do know that it was a riot that he was wanting to avoid. He wanted to, now it wouldn't have been enough for him to just squash a riot. He'd done that previously. He was brutal. This was a brutal man. He had no problems crushing people and crushing a riot violently. So it's not that he had a problem doing that, but the idea of another riot getting back, even if he squashed it, that he's not maintaining peace, he's not competent to do that, for him would have been a bit of a disaster. The point is this. When it comes down to it, the reason he handed Jesus over was because if he didn't, Jesus and the outfall of that would have had a big impact on his own life. Would have changed his life. He wanted his life as it was. He wanted the power. He wanted the status. He wanted the wealth and everything else that comes with it. And he didn't want Jesus. He wasn't about to pay the price of Jesus' freedom at a cost to himself. And so he wanted to just wash his hands of it. You know, reminds me of so many people that we speak to today that they don't know that much about Jesus. They don't really want to know. It's nothing to do with me. I'm not really interested. Sometimes they're interested until it begins to encroach on their lives. Just like Pilate. At that point, oh no, nothing to do with me. I'm not guilty. I've got no part in this. Pilate handed him over. And he handed over the one who he knew was innocent to crucifixion. I mean, that was torture. Torture that is unthinkable in the world in which we live. It wasn't just execution, it was torture. And we see what he was handed over to. They stripped him and dressed him in a scarlet robe. They twisted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and placed the staff in his hand. And then they knelt down before him and mocked him, humiliated him utterly. Hail, King of the Jews. They spat on him. They took the staff and kept hitting him on the head. And after they mocked him, they stripped him of the robe, put his clothes on him, and led him away. Pilate was willing, for the sake of his own ease and his own life, was willing to do that. That's what was at the heart of Pilate. No one is righteous. What about Judas? Well, I'm not going to say much at all about Judas. In fact, what I'm going to say about Judas, kind of, if anything, it's not really about Judas, really. But understand this about Judas. Judas, whatever his motivation for betraying Jesus, whatever else it might have been, At least it was in part for 30 pieces of silver. Now, I'm sure he had other reasons, other motives as well. But 30 pieces of silver, he betrayed Jesus. Now, that money and whatever ideas he was harboring, he would have been thinking about that. Thinking about that. And many scholars reckon that perhaps what Judas was trying to do was force Jesus' hand into taking on the Romans and defeating them or whatever. Who knows? But certainly after the event, then he's stricken, isn't he? Straight after. Almost immediately. Overcome. Whatever part the money played, he realized that just wasn't worth it. And here's the thing, it's not so much about Judas, but here's the thing that I want to share with us this afternoon. That is this. One of the Puritans, a guy called Thomas Watson, wrote a brilliant book called Precious Remedies Against Satan's Devices. And he says in that book that Satan only ever shows us the bait. You know, Judas was probably thinking about things and thinking it's going to work out in some good way. He only ever shows the bait. He never, ever shows the hook. And this is the nature of sin. We get tempted. Judas was tempted to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver because he thought he was going to get something. He saw the bait. What he didn't see is the hook. And he was reeled in, as it were, hook, line, and sinker. You know, sin and giving into the temptation of sin, it never delivers what it's promising. Never. The opposite. There's a terrible price to pay. And there's a warning for every one of us. If we're harboring thoughts that aren't really of God, or if we're being tempted and it looks attractive and appealing, we don't see a cost, we don't see the hook. Don't be deceived. Whatever the case, Judas was certainly not righteous. What about the crowds? Very, very briefly, the crowds. Well, there may have been among the crowds one or two people or a few people looking on for whom this didn't sit comfortably. I'm sure there were some people among the crowds who felt that this wasn't right. Probably among the chief priests as well. Must have been one or two. Whatever the case, they weren't so concerned they were prepared to speak up and do what was right. But the vast majority, a week earlier, they were singing Hosanna to the Son of David. And here they are, they've done a 180. Baying for the blood of Jesus. Now, they'd seen Jesus in action, but here's the thing. When it came down to it, it was just a kind of a public opinion thing. They were just going along with the crowds. And the excitement of seeing a bit of blood, you know, the frenzy of it all. I was speaking to someone just last week about riots and things like that. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where a fight's about to break out. I tell you, you can cut the atmosphere. You really can feel it. It's this terrible atmosphere when two people are about to fight. Maybe you've been in a situation where you're confronted by potential violence and you can feel the violence in the air almost. And there they were, caught up in all of this, and they loved it. Yeah, Hosanna to the Son of David a week earlier, and then crucify. A bit like the religious leaders again. You know, they crucify the Son of God, but with the 30 pieces of silver, they say, we can't break God's law. Better buy a potter's field of that. Utter hypocrisy. The crowds, they weren't righteous. And if there was anyone among them that thought it was wrong, they weren't prepared to do the right thing. None. There is no one righteous. Not even one. And to say that means at the core of our being, we're not righteous. At heart, we're not righteous. On the surface, we might be like the religious leaders. Oh, well, we're not going to, spend the money in the temple. We'll put that to a field. Or like the crowds a week earlier, capable of praising God, lifting their hands and all of that. But the closer they get to the cross, it exposes their real hearts. And that is our problem, all of us. We are guilty sinners. Remember, God loves the world. God so loved the world. This isn't about, I'm not talking about God's love for the world. That's without question. I'm talking about the state of our hearts. That's another issue. What about Barabbas? Behold Jesus. Let's just take a few moments to look at Jesus. I've said there is no one righteous, not even one, except one. Jesus. He was innocent, wasn't he? We know that. Completely innocent. And the wonderful thing about Jesus is when all the charges were coming against him, he was just silent. So look at verse 11 to 13. Now Jesus stood before the governor. Are you the king of the Jews? The governor asked him. And this was Jesus' only answer to him. You say so. While he was being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he didn't answer. So as he's answering Pilate, all the chief priests and the elders, they're all hurling their accusations at him. Jesus was silent. Led like a lamb to the slaughter. Remember, Scully preached on Gethsemane a couple of weeks ago. There, Jesus dealt with the ordeal of the cross, there in the garden. And here he is now, composed, glorious, I would say. The only righteous one of all of them. No one else was righteous but him. And look at what was happening to him. It's shocking, isn't it? And again, it speaks of his humility, his grace, taking upon himself all of that abuse, not retaliating. Why? Because he knows he's got to go to the cross. I'm going to come back to Jesus in a few moments, but we've got to speed up. What about Barabbas? Who is Barabbas? Well, when Jesus was crucified, he was crucified between two other people. Two other criminals, right? So there were three people crucified. Now the Jews, they're not the ones that would erect the cross and get all of that ready. They're not the ones that got all that ready. That would have been the Romans. There was three people who are obviously going to be crucified that day. Three people whom Pilate was about to execute. And many translations say that, Jesus died on the cross between two thieves. The Greek word can be translated as thieves, but it can also be translated in other ways. But being crucifixion, it was certainly something more serious than just they stole stuff. People didn't get crucified just for being thieves. These were almost certainly insurrectionists. And remember the charge against Jesus. He claims to be a king. That's, the Jews are trying to say to Pilate, this is an insurrectionist. What about, but Barabbas, almost certainly, he himself was an insurrectionist. Now that means he was almost certainly the one who's going to be crucified. Barabbas, an insurrectionist. You see, Barabbas was a criminal who deserved crucifixion. And when I ask the question, who is Barabbas? As we think about the answer to that, the first thing that I want to say is this. What about the chief priests? Think about them. wouldn't it have been more fitting for them to have been executed for their crimes? Wouldn't it? Do you think? Think about what they did. What about Pilate? Knowing that Jesus was innocent, but still handed over. Pilate perhaps should have been executed for his crimes. Could say the same about the crowd. All baying for his blood. They don't care really whether he's innocent or not. They were all for him a week earlier. They perhaps deserved to be executed on a cross. What about us? We've already determined, haven't we? If there was ever a time that you as an unbeliever, and there will have been, and me, if we were religious leaders, we had the same problem as them. We would have crucified Jesus. If we was there in the crowds, would you want to say, oh yeah, I would have been the one person who would have stood up for Jesus? No, you wouldn't. Neither would I. Too cowardly. Who is Barabbas? We are Barabbas. All of us. We're the ones that deserve that. It's interesting, the name Barabbas, it means Bar, son of, Abbas, the father. He was the son of the father. So who is Barabbas? We are Barabbas. How could Barabbas possibly have a name like that? Son of the father. I don't believe it's an accident. You see, the last point is this, the great exchange. Barabbas should have been crucified, but he was set free. The one who should have been crucified, which is all of us, the chief priests, the rulers. You know, you read in Acts chapter 6 that many of the chief priests, many of the religious leaders became believers. Amazing, isn't it? In other words, Jesus takes the place of Barabbas on the cross. Barabbas, the undeserving criminal who should have been executed, goes free. That's a wonderful picture for us of the gospel. Jesus took our place. And so as we draw to a close and consider that hard stuff about no one is righteous, not even one. That actually our hearts are so dark naturally that we deserve. We're like Barabbas. We deserve, every one of us deserve to be crucified. And yet Jesus took upon himself, visibly we could see it, all of the guilt of humanity, the sin of humanity. Poured upon him. We could see it physically acted out in the beatings and the rejection and the accusation, all of that. But God was at work in that too. Jesus silently went to the cross in your place and in my place. Well, we look forward, don't we, to Easter. Because we're reminded then, we know then, he didn't stay on the cross. The way has been opened for us to come back to God. Let's pray.